The sea was gray that evening, not the cold steel gray of winter, but a softer hue, like old linen that had known many washings. The air smelled of salt and rain and driftwood, the kind of scent that lingers on old postcards and in the folds of wool coats long after the journey has ended. Margaret Hale stepped off the narrow bus with her single suitcase. The road ended here, at the edge of the village, where cobblestones met the wet sand. A thin mist rose from the shore, and above it, faint and unwavering, the beam of a lighthouse, swept in its endless rhythm, one slow circle every 20 seconds. The driver, an old man with the stooped shoulders of someone who had carried weather his whole life, offered a small nod before closing the doors. "You'll see her light all night," he said quietly through the glass. "She never sleeps." Then the bus growled away, swallowed by the fog, leaving only the sound of the tide breathing against the rocks. Margaret stood still for a while. She wasn't sure whether to call it fatigue or relief that filled her chest, perhaps both. The long months of noise and crowds and polite condolences had worn her down to silence. Here at last, she wanted no more voices, no more explanations, just the slow turning of light above the water. She began walking. The road wound along the cliff, damp with mist, flanked by tufts of seagrass and the occasional white-painted fence. The lighthouse stood at the far point, pale and tall against the dimming sky. It was said to have been built in 1889, when the sea was rougher and the ships more fragile, though no one could remember the last time a keeper had lived there. Yet the light still shone. Inside her coat pocket, Margaret's fingers brushed a folded letter, a brief, formal note from the property agency in St. Ives. "Dear Mrs. Hale, the property is functional but not serviced. Electricity and water are supplied from the main line. The light mechanism remains automated. Keys enclosed. Functional but not serviced." That sounded about right for her life at the moment. When she reached the base of the lighthouse, the world seemed to quiet even more. The wind softened, the sea drew back its roar to a hush, and the fog folded itself around her like a shawl. The door, a round-topped wooden thing painted blue once and now faded to gray, creaked as she pushed it open. Inside, the air was cool and faintly metallic. A spiral staircase climbed along the wall, its rail cold beneath her hand. She could hear the hum of machinery somewhere above, steady, pulsing like a heartbeat in metal. At the first landing, she found the small living quarters, a single room with a narrow bed, an iron stove, a table by the window, and shelves lined with dust and forgotten things. A chipped mug, a brass compass, a jar of matches. The floorboards groaned under her step, as though acknowledging her presence after a long absence. Margaret set down her suitcase and took a slow breath. The air smelled of salt and rust, but beneath that, there was something else. Faint, like tea leaves left to dry, or paper stored too long in a drawer. She lit a match and touched it to the old oil lamp on the table. The flame bloomed, small and steady, and she exhaled softly as its glow filled the room. Outside, the fog pressed against the window, turning the world into a soft blur of white and silver. The beam of the lighthouse cut through it at intervals, sweeping a thin line of light across her face. Margaret unpacked only what she needed: a sweater, her journal, a tin of tea, and an old fountain pen that had belonged to her husband. The rest could wait. She filled the kettle with cold water from the tap, set it on the stove, and sat by the window while it came to a slow boil. The sea moved below, calm, repetitive, almost hypnotic. Somewhere out there, a buoy bell chimed, its sound distant and low, perfectly timed with the turning of the light. Margaret wrote in her journal, "First night, fog thick, the light moves like breath. I feel neither lonely nor accompanied, something between." She paused, pen hovering. Outside, the beam turned again, then faded. leaving a soft afterglow on the mist. When the kettle whistled, she poured herself a cup of tea, strong and unsweetened, and sat back, listening. The lighthouse made its own music, the hum of the generator, the whisper of wind through the vents, the occasional pop of old wood adjusting to the cool night air. Hours passed in that quiet. Later, when she finally lay down, she noticed something curious. Each time the light turned past the window, the faintest shadow seemed to move across the wall. Not quite human, not quite pattern. Just a flicker, as if the air itself remembered someone who used to live here. She watched it a while. The rhythm was soothing. The light circled, the waves rolled, and somewhere in between them her thoughts began to slow. Half asleep, she thought she heard a faint sound, like paper sliding over stone, a whisper perhaps, or the sigh of the sea pressing against the rocks below. When she rose in the morning, she found a thin envelope on the floor, half tucked under the door. Her heart gave a slow, puzzled beat. The paper was old, yellowed slightly, the edges curled with damp. No name on it, no stamp, only a single word, written in careful handwriting. Welcome. Margaret stood very still. The light above continued its patient turning, one circle after another, as it had for more than a century. Outside, the sea was silver in the dawn, and the fog was beginning to lift. She smiled faintly, not quite afraid, not quite certain what to feel. She placed the letter on the table beside her teacup, tracing the single word with her fingertip. "Thank you," she whispered, almost without realizing, and then she sat down by the window, watching the horizon brighten, the beam of the lighthouse softening into daylight. The day unfolded slowly, waves, wind, gulls, the creak of stairs. Margaret began to tidy the room to make it hers. She found an old record player beneath the bed, its surface dusty but intact. No records, though, only the faint smell of linseed oil and sea. By evening, she had written another page in her journal. The lighthouse seems alive in small ways. I feel watched, but gently, as if by someone patient. Maybe it's the sea itself. As the fog returned that night, thicker and denser than before, she brewed another cup of tea and waited by the window, listening to the hum of the unseen world beyond the glass. And though she would never admit it aloud, a small part of her, the part that still dreamed in quiet moments, hoped there would be another letter waiting when she awoke. The second morning began with the smell of rain, not sharp or cold, but faint, like the scent of water gathered on old rope. The fog had thinned during the night, and through the window Margaret could see the long stretch of seaweed-glazed rocks glimmering beneath a sky the color of pewter. She sat at the small table, hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long since cooled. The letter from the night before still lay beside it. Welcome. The words seemed to have settled into the room itself, as though the walls had absorbed it. Margaret turned the envelope over again, searching for a seam or sign of newness, but it looked as though it had been here for years, paper softened by time, ink faded to the color of the sea in early dawn. It might have been a trick of the wind. The door didn't seal perfectly. Perhaps something from the storeroom below had blown in. That was the reasonable explanation. She told herself so, as she folded the letter and slipped it between the pages of her journal. Still, there was something tender about it. Not eerie, not even particularly strange, just noticed, as though someone had marked her arrival not with curiosity, but with kindness. She decided to stay another night. By midday, the fog had rolled back in, heavy as wool. The sea disappeared entirely, replaced by the muffled sound of waves and the slow call of distant gulls. The light turned above, its beam carving a faint path through the mist. Margaret spent the hours exploring the lower rooms. Most were empty, save for a few wooden crates stacked neatly along the wall, their lids nailed shut. There was a workshop of sorts, cluttered with tools that had rusted gracefully. Wrenches, oil cans, a small lamp with its wick turned to dust. In the corner stood an old desk, its surface uneven with years of use. On it she found a single drawer that stuck halfway open. Inside lay a few rolled charts, a fountain pen without ink, and a small music box carved from dark wood. She turned the key slowly. The mechanism groaned, then began to play a fragile melody, just 3 or 4 notes repeating, faint but steady. The sound filled the circular room, mingling with the hum of the machinery above, creating a kind of harmony. She didn't recognize the tune, yet it stirred something in her chest, a memory too soft to name. When the melody wound down, the silence afterward felt like the pause between breaths. That night she dreamed of light, not the sharp beam of the lantern, but a gentler kind, flickering like candlelight over water. In her dream, she stood on the spiral staircase, looking up, and saw someone at the top. Not clearly, just the outline of a figure standing near the glass, gazing out at the endless dark sea. When she awoke, the air in the room was cool and damp. The lamp beside her had burned out. She rose, rubbing her eyes, and there, by the door, lay another envelope. This one was unsealed. Inside, a single slip of paper with 4 words, written in the same neat hand. Do not fear the light. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, the paper trembling slightly between her fingers. She wasn't frightened. Not exactly. There was something oddly reassuring about the message, as though whoever wrote it understood her hesitation, her quiet unease. She set the letter beside the first one on the table and made tea. Outside, the fog glowed faintly, tinted by the slow-turning beam above. She opened the window just enough to feel the air against her skin. Cool, damp, salt-sweet. She whispered, "Who are you?" into the mist. The wind carried her voice away. All day she listened, not expecting an answer, but listening anyway. The lighthouse had its own rhythm. The pipes clicked as the temperature shifted. Somewhere above, the lens turned with a faint mechanical sigh. Occasionally, she thought she heard something beyond the machinery, a soft murmur, too steady to be the sea, too human to be wind. By evening, she felt an odd peace settle over her. It reminded her of the afternoons years ago when her husband James would fall asleep in his chair while she read. Those quiet moments where nothing was asked of her but to be present, where stillness itself felt like company. She spent that night reading an old book she had brought, poetry, the kind written long before the world became loud. The words seemed to match the rhythm of the lighthouse, slow, patient, filled with pauses. Halfway through, she paused, listening again. There it was, faint, rising through the hum of the wind, a tune. Just a few notes, like the music box's song, but played somewhere distant, higher up the tower. She set the book aside and climbed the spiral stairs, her lamp casting a warm circle of light on the walls. The air grew colder as she ascended. The sound was clearer now, delicate, drifting like smoke. At the top, the glass room opened around her, the lens turning slowly, bathing everything in pale light. She saw no one, only the sea below, invisible under the thick fog and the rhythmic sweep of light disappearing into it. Still, the melody continued, faint, as though coming from within the machinery itself. She listened for a long time. The tune was incomplete, looping back before it could finish. It reminded her of something left unsaid. When she finally returned to her room, she found another note resting on a journal. She was sure it hadn't been there when she left. This one read, "You are not the first to hear the sea sing." She touched the paper lightly, half smiling. Whoever, whatever, Pismo, was leaving these messages had a gentle hand. There was no malice in them, only a sense of remembrance, of continuity, as though the lighthouse itself was keeping her company. She wrote in her journal that night, "The light feels alive, the sea hums beneath it, and I feel as though I've stepped into someone else's dream, but it's a kind dream, one that asks nothing from me except to listen." The days began to blend after that. Morning fog, tea, the sound of waves, the patient turn of the light. Each night, another note. Sometimes a single word, "Stay." Sometimes a fragment, "The keeper watches kindly." Margaret began to respond in her journal, as though writing to the unseen visitor. She never left her pages open, yet she often woke to find faint traces of salt water near the edges, as if touched by a wet fingertip. One evening, as she prepared her supper, a simple bowl of soup and bread, she heard a low knocking sound, rhythmic and slow. Not on the door, but from beneath the floorboards. She froze, listening. The knocking stopped, then resumed, softer this time. She knelt, pressing her palm against the wood. The boards were cool. "Hello?" she said, almost whispering. The answer came not as a sound, but as a vibration. Two gentle pulses, like the heartbeat of the place itself. It was strangely comforting. She found herself smiling. Afterwards, she poured herself another cup of tea and sat by the window, the fog swirling outside. The lighthouse beam passed across her face, illuminating the steam from her cup. For the first time in months, maybe years, she felt truly at rest. She stayed awake long enough to see the tide rise. It crept up the rocks below, silvered by moonlight. The wind grew softer, carrying with it a faint scent of lilac, and then she saw it. A light far out at sea. Not a ship's lamp, nor a reflection of her own beam, but a steady, low glow, hovering where the water met the horizon. It pulsed once, then again, in perfect rhythm with the turning of her lighthouse. Margaret watched, transfixed. When the fog thickened once more and the light disappeared, she closed her eyes and whispered, "Good night, whoever you are." The next morning there was no letter under the door, only a smooth pebble placed carefully on the windowsill, pale gray, round, warm from the sun. She turned it in her hand. On its surface, faintly etched, were 3 small initials. E.H. Margaret traced them gently with her thumb, feeling an inexplicable sadness and comfort both at once. When she looked out to sea, the water was calm and silver again, the horizon soft. The beam of the lighthouse swept quietly across it, patient and eternal. And though she didn't know who E.H. had been, she whispered the name aloud, letting it blend with the sound of waves. "Thank you," she said. The lighthouse hummed on, keeping its endless watch, the light that never slept. The wind changed on the 3rd evening. It came not from the open sea, but from inland, threading through the cliffs and carrying with it the scent of wet earth and heather. The fog loosened, lifting in pale ribbons that revealed, for the first time, the outline of the village far below. A scatter of slate roofs, a single steeple, a narrow harbor dotted with unmoving boats. Margaret watched from the lantern room, hands resting on the cold railing. The beam swept across the water, steady as a breath. Somewhere beneath her feet, the machinery hummed its endless note. She had begun to hear it differently now, not as a sound, but as a pulse. She thought often of the initials carved into the pebble. E.H. Whoever had left it seemed to move through the place like weather, invisible but unmistakable. Sometimes she felt the temperature shift when she entered a room, a faint coolness that brushed her skin and was gone. Other times she caught a whiff of pipe smoke, though she had none herself. That night she sat at the little desk with her journal open. "I think E.H. must have loved this place," she wrote. "The light, the solitude. Perhaps he, or she, was the last keeper. There is kindness here, not haunting. The air feels watched over. The lamp beside her flickered once, as if in answer. She smiled. "If you're listening," she whispered, "I need to stay a while." The room settled around her, and the wind against the glass softened to a sigh. For several days the weather held. Sunlight poured through the windows in long gold bands that warmed the wooden floorboards. Margaret walked along the path above the cliffs, breathing the salt and gorse. Each evening she returned with small treasures, a fragment of glass polished. By the sea, a feather-striped gray and white, a broken bit of pottery that might once have been part of a sailor's bowl. She placed them on the windowsill beside the pebble, an altar of simple things. One afternoon, she met the postmaster from the village, a gentleman in his 70s who delivered parcels once a week. His name was Dorian Price. He brought a basket of bread and apples, explaining that the locals liked to be sure the lighthouse tenants ate well. "It's good to see her light burning again," he said, glancing up at the tower. "Makes the fishermen easy in their minds." "Again?" she asked. "I thought it never stopped." He shrugged. "It hasn't, not truly. But there was a time the beam faltered, back when keeper Edwin Hart was here. Fine man. Stayed on long after they made it automatic. Wouldn't leave, even when they told him he could. Said the light needed a soul to mind it." Margaret's heart gave a small, wondering pause. "Edwin Hart," she murmured. "E.H." Dorian nodded. "That's the one. Died here, poor fellow. Peacefully, they say. Sat in his chair by the lens one night and never woke, but he kept the lamp trimmed every evening right up to the end." After he left, the lighthouse felt different, not heavier, just more present, as though the name had stirred something in its walls. That night the wind returned, stronger, threading through every crack with a low humming tone that matched the rhythm of the sea. The sound was almost like a voice, not words, but a cadence, a rise and fall that might have been language once. Margaret lit the oil lamp and climbed the stairs. Each step echoed softly. At the top, the great lens turned, vast and patient, scattering rainbows on the metal walls. She stood before it, the beam sliding across her hands. "Edwin Hart," she said aloud, tasting the name. "Are you still keeping watch?" The answer came as a movement of air, a single slow gust that passed through her hair and across her cheek, carrying the faintest warmth like breath. The light brightened for one heartbeat, then returned to its usual rhythm. It was enough. She descended slowly, the calm settling deep into her bones. There was no fear in her, only a strange tenderness. In the following days, she began to talk to the lighthouse as though it were a living companion. When she brewed tea, she would set an empty cup across the table. When she read, she would read aloud softly, her voice mingling with the crackle of the stove. She felt less alone than she had in years. Sometimes she thought she heard the music box playing upstairs without her winding it, a faint tune drifting down the stairwell, always the same unfinished melody. One night, as she wrote by lamplight, she found herself adding words she hadn't planned. Perhaps the sea keeps its promises through those who wait. When she looked again, there was a faint, damp ring on the page, the mark of a cup that was not hers. She laughed quietly, almost shyly. "You're a polite guest," she said. "I like that." Outside, the tide rose high against the rocks. The windows misted over, and the fog thickened until the world beyond disappeared entirely. Only the light remained, circling and circling. Near midnight, the whisper returned. It began in the vent above her bed, a soft murmur, as though someone were speaking from very far away. She listened without moving. The words were indistinct, broken by the wind, but the tone was unmistakably gentle, almost apologetic. "Stay," it seemed to say. The light needs you. Margaret's eyes filled, not with fear, but with something close to gratitude. She whispered back, "I will." Sleep came easily then. The sound of the waves merged with the rhythm of the turning lens, and her dreams were filled with soft grey light. In the morning the air smelled of rain again, and on the table lay another note. The handwriting was the same careful script, though shakier now, as if written with an unsteady hand. "When you breathe, the sea listens," she traced the words with her finger. The ink smudged slightly as though still wet. For the first time in years, she felt her heart open, slow and wide, like the tide coming in. The days stretched into one another, each softer than the last. Margaret wrote less in her journal and watched more. The clouds shifting, the gulls circling, the color of the water changing hour by hour. The world seemed to slow its heartbeat to match hers. One evening, while the sun set in a band of silver and rose, she climbed to the lantern room again. She wanted to polish the glass, though it hardly needed it. The effort felt like prayer, small, steady, wordless. As she worked, the light glinted on something caught in the metal grating near the base of the lens. She knelt and reached for it. Her fingers closed around a small brass object, cold and heavy. It was a key. On its tack, almost worn smooth, she could just make out the engraved letters, E.H. When she held it up, the beam passed through it, casting a thin golden line across her palm. She stood for a long while, the key warm in her hand. Somewhere deep below, a door creaked, not loudly but enough that she heard it. The lower storeroom, perhaps, shifting with the wind. The next day, she searched the base of the lighthouse again, opening crates, testing locks. Most doors yielded easily, but one, a narrow iron hatch behind the staircase, was sealed with a small padlock, its surface eaten by rust. The key fit perfectly. Inside lay a tiny chamber, scarcely large enough for a chair and a narrow table. Dust floated in the still air like pale motes of light. On the table sat a logbook bound in cracked leather. She opened it carefully. The handwriting within was firm, deliberate. March 14th, 1952, light holds steady. Fog dense. If ever the sea takes me, let it know I was grateful. Page after page followed, entries spanning years, some only a line or two, some whole paragraphs. The later ones grew shakier, the sentences shorter, but all carried the same tone, patience, devotion, quiet love for the sea and its light. The final entry read simply, April 2nd, wind strong tonight. The beam must not fail. If someone finds this, keep her burning. Margaret closed the book gently. The air in the small room was warm now, touched by a faint scent of salt and oil. Edwin, she whispered. She's still burning. When she emerged, dusk had deepened. The wind had fallen silent, the sky smooth and pale above the sea. She felt the stillness settle around her like a blessing. Later, as she sat by the window with her tea, she heard the faintest echo of the music box again. But this time, the melody finished. The last note hung in the air, clear and perfect, before fading into the sound of waves. She smiled, eyes closing. The key lay on the table beside her, gleaming softly in the lamplight. Outside, the lighthouse turned its patient circle. The light never slept, and neither, it seemed, did love. A week passed, though Margaret hardly marked the days. The rhythms of ordinary time, news, appointments, clocks, had drifted away like old buoys pulled from their ropes. The sea and the light had become her measure of life, the slow sweep of the beam, the hush of the tide, the patient rise of morning. She slept deeply now, waking without the heavy ache that used to fill her chest. Yet each dawn brought the sense that something was gathering, drawing near in a gentle, expectant way, like the slow inhalation before a sigh. On the 8th evening, the air changed again. It was unusually still. The fog held motionless over the water. No wind, no cry of gulls, not even the click of the pipes. The silence felt round and complete. Margaret was in the lantern room polishing the brass rails when the first sound came, a single note from nowhere, like glass struck softly. Then another and another, until the music box tune rose into the air without the box itself. The melody was whole now, unfolding slowly, tenderly, as if time itself were listening. She set down the cloth and stood very still. The light brightened, not harshly, but with the glow of dawn compressed into one long breath. Within it, shapes began to form in the mist outside the glass, shimmering, almost human outlines that shifted with each turn of the beam. "Edwin?" she whispered. The name seemed to ripple through the air. The figures drew closer until there was only one, not quite a man, not quite a shadow, but something between, a presence wearing the calm of a life well ended. He did not speak, but Margaret felt the words more than heard them. "You kept her burning." Her throat tightened. "I only stayed," she said softly. "You did the keeping." The presence seemed to smile without movement. The light swept across them both, and for a heartbeat she saw the lantern room as it must have been 70 years ago. Polished instruments, brass gleaming, the logbook open, a cup of tea steaming beside a worn chair. Then the image faded, leaving the present quiet and real again. She understood suddenly why the letters had come, why the pebble waited on her sill. The lighthouse had remembered its keeper, and the keeper had remembered the light. They had needed a living hand to bridge that remembrance, someone to bear witness, to carry it forward. The beam circled once more, slower now, its edge touching her face with warmth. She felt tears rise, not of sadness, but of recognition, as if some long thread in her had been drawn gently home. "I will stay until morning," she whispered. "Then I'll leave her in peace." The figure inclined its head. The glow around it softened, thinning until only the reflection of the lens remained. The music dwindled to 3 notes, then silence. Margaret descended the stairs step by step, the brass key cool in her palm. Down in the living room, she lit the stove and brewed tea, steadying her hands. Outside the windows, the fog glowed faintly, lit from within by the revolving beam. The light no longer felt distant or mechanical. It breathed in rhythm with her. She opened the logbook once more and turned to a blank page after Edwin's final entry. Her pen moved without hesitation. "April 12th. The light holds steady. Fog dense. Keep her at rest. All is well." When she closed the book, a deep stillness filled the room, like a held breath released. The machinery above hummed quietly, a contented sound. Later, she carried the key down to the small chamber where she'd found the logbook. The air there was warmer than before, scented faintly with lamp oil and salt. She placed the key on the table and whispered, "Thank you." For a moment she thought she heard the faint scrape of a chair, the creak of old boots on the floor, and then the sound blended into the rhythm of the waves outside. That night, sleep took her swiftly. She dreamed of light again, this time not confined to the lantern, but spilling across the sea, painting the fog with soft gold. In the dream, she saw herself walking along the water's edge beside a man she did not know but somehow loved. They spoke without words, only gestures, and each time she pointed toward the lighthouse, he nodded content. When she woke before dawn, the first thing she noticed was the smell of fresh air, clean and sweet. The fog had gone. Through the clear window she could see the horizon stretching wide and calm. The sea was a mirror. For a while she simply sat in the early light, breathing. Then she rose, made tea, and carried her cup outside. The stones were damp under her feet, cool with the memory of night. The lighthouse behind her gleamed white against the pale sky. Its beam, unnecessary now, dimmed gradually as the sun lifted. She walked to the edge of the cliff where the grass met the stone and watched the morning spread. Far below, the tide sighed against the rocks, steady and unhurried. Every sound, the whisper of wind, the low murmur of water, seemed to say the same thing, enough. Margaret smiled faintly. She felt lighter than she had in years. When she turned back, she saw movement in the lantern room far above. a flicker of shadow, or perhaps only the reflection of sunlight through the glass. She lifted her hand in a small salute. "Good morning, Edwin," she said. The light winked once, like an answer. She spent the rest of the day cleaning the rooms, stacking the few things she had brought, leaving everything neat. The pebble and the feather she left on the sill, the music box on the table, the logbook open to her entry. It felt right, as though the lighthouse had needed her only for this small act of tending. By late afternoon, she sat one last time at the window, watching the sea darken to blue. The beam began again, a soft arc of gold across the water. It no longer seemed endless, only eternal in the quiet way that kindness is eternal. She wrote a final note in her journal. "I came to be alone and found instead a conversation that never needed words." The light will go on. So will I. She closed the book and rested her hands on it. For a long time she simply breathed, letting her thoughts drift with the sound of the waves until they thinned into stillness. Outside, the first stars appeared, faint as memory. The lighthouse turned once more, patient and bright, watching over the sea that never truly slept. The dawn came softly, without wind or fog, the sea lying flat and silver under a wide, pale sky. Margaret woke to the sound of gulls wheeling high above, and the faint metallic click of the light's mechanism completing its cycle for the last time that night. She lay still for a long while, listening to the small sounds that filled the quiet. The stove ticking as it cooled, the faint lap of water against stone, her own slow breath. She felt no urgency now. The hours stretched smooth before her, unbroken, patient. After tea, she packed what little she owned, her journal, her coat, the pen, a single scarf that still carried the scent of sea salt. Everything else she left behind for the lighthouse to keep. On the table, she set the music box, wound once, so that the soft tune filled the room as she moved about. It sounded different in daylight, lighter, as if the melody had found its ending and was content to rest there. When she stepped outside, the air was cool against her face. The cliff path glittered with dew. Behind her, the lighthouse stood radiant in the early sun, its white walls tinged gold. She turned to look up at the lantern room. For a moment, the glass caught the light and flared like an open eye. Then the brightness eased, leaving only the steady shimmer of morning. Margaret started down the path toward the village, her suitcase light in her hand. Halfway down, she stopped and looked back. The beam was faint now, but still turning, tracing a slow circle across the calm sea. It seemed to follow her for a moment, then let her go. By the time she reached the edge of the harbor, the village was waking. Doors opening, a child's laugh, the smell of bread baking somewhere unseen. She paused at the post office, where Dorian Price was setting out a crate of letters. "Well," he said, smiling, "the light looks bright as ever. You keeping her company, Mrs. Hale?" "For a while longer," she replied. "She doesn't need much minding now." He nodded thoughtfully. "Never really did. Still, it's good to know someone's there." She handed him a sealed envelope. "If anyone asks about the lighthouse, will you give them this?" He glanced at the front to the next keeper and tucked it carefully into his jacket. Of course, the bus didn't come for another hour. Margaret walked to the edge of the pier and sat on a low wall. The tide was coming in, slow and deliberate. She closed her eyes and felt the rhythm of it, the push, the draw, the endless breathing of the sea. In her mind, she heard again the whisper she had once thought was wind. "Stay. The light needs you." But now the words had changed. They said, "Go. The light will keep itself." When she opened her eyes, the horizon shimmered. Far out, she thought she saw a faint gleam, like a lantern set upon the water, flashing once, twice, in farewell. Then it was gone. The bus arrived with a low sigh of brakes. Margaret climbed aboard and took the back seat by the window. As it pulled away, she watched the road curve up toward the cliff until the lighthouse appeared one last time between the folds of land, small but unwavering against the sky. For a long while she kept her gaze fixed there, until distance blurred it into brightness. She did not return to the city. Instead, she found a cottage a few miles inland, where the wind smelled of pine rather than salt, and nights were deep and quiet. The world felt wide again. Sometimes, when she lit her evening lamp, she caught herself turning the wick with the same careful motion she had used at the lighthouse. The gesture made her smile. She began to write, not memoirs exactly, but reflections, pages of slow sentences that drifted between memory and dream. She wrote of light that never slept, of letters without names, of voices in the fog that asked nothing but to be heard. The words came gently like tide water. Every so often she would pause, listening for the low hum she had come to know so well. It was there if she waited long enough, not in her ears but somewhere deeper. The steady heartbeat of a place that had taught her the meaning of quiet. Months passed. The seasons turned. In late spring, she received a postcard from Dorian Price. A new keeper had arrived, a young woman, eager, respectful. The light burned steady, the note read. She says she sometimes finds the air faintly sweet with tea. Margaret read the line twice, then set the card on her mantel. The fire crackled softly behind her. That night she dreamed again of the sea, calm and wide. The lighthouse stood on the horizon, its beam sweeping lazily across the water. Beside her walked a figure in an old coat, hands clasped behind his back. They did not speak. They didn't need to. The world around them glowed with the soft gold of unending dawn. When she woke, her heart was peaceful. The morning light filtered through the curtains, warm and forgiving. Outside, birds moved through the trees, their wings making small, contented sounds. She brewed tea and sat by the window. Steam curled upward, catching the sunlight. The cup warmed her hands. In that moment she understood something simple and complete, that solitude had not been emptiness, but space. Space where the living and the remembered could meet for a while, exchange kindness and part in peace. She whispered into the quiet, "All is well, Edwin," and somewhere, carried on the soft wind that always finds its way inland, came the faintest answer, no louder than breath, no clearer than thought. "All is well." Margaret smiled. She leaned back in her chair, eyes half closed, listening to the far-off sound of waves she could no longer see, but would always hear. The light was still turning somewhere out there beyond the hills, keeping watch, never sleeping. Its rhythm matched her own, slow and even, until the edges of the room softened and the world once more became a sea of quiet, and in that gentle expanse between waking and rest, she drifted, weightless, into the calm she had come so far to find.